welcome back Weirds and Weeboos to the channel Double Chin Dough, where today I am covering this budget Citron deck. Okay, look, I know at first glance it looks like a mess, but believe it or not, stick with me here, because this is what I used to get to rank 50 on my free-to-play account again.
Actually, yeah, sorry to do this. I just want to very quickly, before I really show the deck, please listen to what I have to say before you go typing in the comments. I know what people are going to be like. There's a reason this video is so long. I have a lot to say when it came to both the journey I went on playing this deck, as well as how I made the deck and why it is made the way it is. Hours of thought and time has gone into this deck, and in the end, it performed really, really good despite what you might think when you first look at it. And while I did use multiple budget plant decks to get to Ultimate League this season, this deck right here was by far the most influential one in my journey. So even though I'm sure many of you are going to do it anyway, just please don't start typing in the comments until you hear this deck actually explained. One last thing I will say, just for the sake of not being misleading though, is I should make clear from the beginning of this video, if you are here as basically a brand new player, which I doubt will be many of you at all, but if it just so happens that you actually are really new to this game and you have been looking for good budget decks and somehow my video is the first one you stumble across, I want to make it clear that unfortunately this might not be for you. You see, with my budget decks, I like to kind of go for a niche player base that usually doesn't get much acknowledgement. That being that I do believe there's actually quite a few people who are probably pretty skilled and experienced at this game, but still just don't have very full collections. It takes a long time to earn everything in this game, especially if you're free to play. And so you may well have played for years and still be missing a lot of cards. Or maybe you have one really powerful expensive deck, but aside from that one deck, everything else you have is kind of cheap. When most people make budget decks, they make them to be not only cheap in terms of rarity and spark cost, but they also tend to make their game plans as consistent and straightforward as possible. And don't get me wrong, in fairness, most decks are made like that. And that does make the decks very beginner friendly. So don't worry, if you are a newer player and you're a bit disappointed this video probably won't be well catered towards you, seriously, just look up other budget decks for like 5 minutes and you'll get probably 50 different options of very easy to play decks that are made with almost entirely uncommons and rares. There's budget sports, budget aggro solar flare, you get the picture. But none of that is new. None of that is interesting. And the problem with these budget decks that are popularly spread around as decks that budget players should use is that they kind of assume that you must be a new player. And if you're not a new player, I would actually argue that it varies, but they tend to not be that great for you. Ultimately, while these decks are good to say they're budget decks, a lot of the times these decks still lose out to most of the competition. They're really good early on against opponents that aren't skilled enough to counterplay these decks, but once you get to the point that you do have opponents that are pretty experienced in the game and know how to ruin your strategy, these decks are so single-minded and so consistency-based and so easy to pilot that there isn't really much you can do to change the outcome. So here it is. This deck essentially says screw consistency, but what it gets in return is the ability to run 3 separate deck archetypes simultaneously packed into one deck, which grants you an amazing level of adaptability so that if you know the game very well, you can change your game plan on the fly to be able to adapt to whatever your opponent is and be able to beat the vast majority of deck archetypes out there on the ladder, all with one deck, even despite the fact that you're going to have worse cards. And that's great if you are an experienced player trying to get the most you physically can out of the game, despite the fact that you have a weak collection. But if you're a brand new player that is still learning the game and doesn't know all the superpowers of all the heroes off by heart, and isn't counting powers so you know exactly how many powers have been played this game and how many they would have earned from the start of the game and their block meter, if you're not doing this sort of next level stuff, which you wouldn't be doing when you're brand new, you need to take time to learn, you're not going to get the extra mileage that this deck provides by sacrificing its consistency. And as a result, you're just going to be playing a messy, confusing deck that's not really going to help you. But for those players who are trying to get the maximum amount of distance they can with a weak collection, I do think this deck is very optimized for that purpose. Now, in fairness, this deck isn't the one deck list, because of the fact that, yes, just like the other videos, this is on my free-to-play account. And so it's less that I am choosing to use loads of uncommons and rares and all that, and more that I am using whatever my free-to-play account happens to have in its collection. And this is something that often gets ignored when people talk about budget decks, is that the vast majority of free-to-play players do have legendaries. They do have super rares. They just are stuck with 1 to 2 copies of them, which is not enough to make a consistent deck around. Personally, for the current deck list that you're seeing on screen, I only had to craft 2 copies of Forget-Me-Nots, because I only owned half of them. And that was a good thing to craft anyway, considering Forget-Me-Nots is literally the best 1-drop on the entire plant side, and you're going to run 4 copies of them in every Guardian deck you ever make, basically. Other than that, I crafted nothing for this deck. And I do realize there's a lot of event cards here, but again, if you're an experienced budget player, but you still just have a bit of a weak collection, one of the main kinds of cards you'll have lots of are event cards from playing the game regularly all year round. And yes, if you are one of these more experienced budget players, hopefully by the time you finish this video, you'll have a good understanding of what makes this deck tick, so you'll be able to take out pieces and put back in pieces as you like, without actually destroying the core game plan of the deck. If you're looking at cards and thinking, I don't have those, that's fine. If you're thinking, hang on a minute, why aren't you running this? It's probably because I didn't own it, and if you own it, go ahead, put it in. It's less about knowing which cards you need, as in literally there is only one option, just put this card in, and more about knowing what tools you need, and there are often multiple options. And then you just pick the best options you have available. As an example, later in the video, you'll see me show off a more aggressive variant of the deck, and in this variant of the deck, there's a very good example of this in the 2-drop slot. You can see we have 1 Laser Cattail, 1 Lightning Reed, and a couple of Pear Pals. This is really confusing on first glance. This does look really messy and incoherent, but I mean, when you actually take a closer look, it's pretty clear that the deck just needs a decently statted 2-drop to play that's Amphibious. And the best one we could play would probably be Laser Cattail, but I only own 1 of them, so I put in a Lightning Reed, but I also only own 1 of those, so I put in 2 Pear Pals. It's not like I needed at least 4 Laser Cattails, it's more that I needed at least 4 plants that were 2-drop Amphibious. And of course, there's multiple plants that fit that description, so I just used whichever ones I had on deck. Okay, yeah, sorry for all that. But if you're here, you're probably already strapped in for the long haul, so let's get into the actual meat of the video.
I've been to rank 50 many times before, and even being to rank 50 on this free-to-play account, I already did a few months ago with Wall Knight. But the big difference this time is when I did it with Wall Knight, that was before the most recent update, where the game finally received a balanced patch after years of silence. In this balance patch, over 150 cards have been affected. And I would say, to many people's dismay I imagine, the advantage has finally swapped over from the plants being the stronger side, as they were before this meta, to the zombies being significantly stronger. I know there's 2 kinds of people that are kind of offended by that statement. On one hand, it is kind of well known at this point, it's almost a meme, that for every moderately but not that well experienced player who plays PvZ Heroes, who's like played the game for a bit but they don't really understand the game at a really high level, it's a very common staple opinion, oh, zombies are just better, zombies are just stronger, doesn't matter what the meta is, doesn't matter if the plant decks are actually dominating, people always seem to think zombies are better because they get to play tricks last. And so I feel like there's a tendency to just disregard it from a lot more experienced players. Whenever anyone's saying that the zombies are stronger, it's just a noob opinion. And don't get me wrong, in the past it has often been kinda like that. I've been here since set 1, and I can tell you, no matter what the meta was, I have seen basically every meta this game has been through, there has always been a large and loud crowd of people saying, zombies are better, even as plants dominate. And in fact, I'd even say the meta we just had, the sort of late stage set 4 meta, is probably the strongest the plants have ever been. They have had a massive advantage over the zombies, I would say. Between the power of the Guardian package, including Forget-Me-Nots and Gravebusters, as well as Blockbusters, so that you can remove all options for zombies to get last say, and on top of that, just the brutal tempo that the meta decks can actually get for plants, whereas for zombies, that kind of tempo is usually a lot more risky and luck-based. The ridiculous consistency on the plant side has made them extremely oppressive, and I think the best example of that is Tempo Grass Knuckles, being probably the most insane deck of all time, honestly. Like, it's simple and boring, but damn, it's just stupidly consistently good and has, like, almost no counterplay. Or at least had. But of course, now the nerfs are in, as well as the buffs. And man, did the plants get hit hard. But this brings us to the other half of people that might not like the statement. The old heads. I think there's a lot more experienced players out there that are trying to immediately say, no, the plants are fine right now. You just need to adapt and change. Stop playing Tempo Grass Knuckles, learn how to actually play decks other than the top tier meta decks from last meta, and you'll do fine on the plants. And I think this attitude is understandable, but kind of cold and misguided. In that there is some truth to this. There are still plant decks out there that are doing fine at top ranks. But my counter to that is that almost every plant deck that's doing good right now isn't doing good on its own merits, but is rather doing good because of how it can be used to counter the good decks the zombies are running. In other words, if there was a sudden meta shift, a lot of the good zombie decks right now would still be pretty good because they're good decks because they're just powerful. That simple. Whereas a lot of the plant decks are really good because they shut down the zombie decks that are good right now. But if the zombie decks that were good changed, these decks would collapse. Between OTKs that take advantage of the slower meta we have, now that a lot of high tempo cards have been nerfed, the Nightcap and Rose control decks that are running rampant right now, considering that on Nightcap's side, Kabloom is probably the only plant class that came out of this looking better than before the update. And for Rose's side, right now, Wingnut is arguably the single most important plant card to be running in any deck in the entire game right now. So to be clear, it's not that there aren't plant decks that are winning right now, it's that the plant decks that are winning are one, winning based on countering other good decks more so than being good decks in their own right, and two, these decks are almost always stupidly expensive. By far, what I've seen the most of at the top of the ladder when it comes to plant players has been Nightcap and Rose control decks that run like 3 or 4 copies of Dark Matter Dragonfruit, something your average budget player definitely does not own. Not to mention all the Brainanas they need to even get there. I've seen Grass Knuckles OTK decks with the reworked Mirror Nut and Picanolith, which, again, Picanolith is a legendary, Mirror Nut is a super rare. And the only other thing I've seen doing well is Chompzilla Tempo decks, which are a bit more straightforward. However, all the good tempo cards that Chompzilla has that haven't been nuked by nerfs are legendaries. It's your Bananasaurus Rexes, it's your Allosauruses, it's your Apatosauruses, now that untrickable is a more coveted keyword in the new meta. Every plant deck I see that's actually performing well right now is legendary spam. And so let's be real, you see where this is going. Budget plants right now is a nightmare, but that makes it perfect content for me. Who doesn't like a little bit of masochism on the internet? Now, as tempting as it was to just immediately jump into a game with a brand new deck, using all these new changes, the harsh reality set in very quickly that realistically speaking, I did not have the resources to make an actual brand new deck using the new balance changes. I mean, I could take a deck that already existed and do it a teeny bit differently because some cards in that deck are weaker or stronger now, or some things that shut down the deck aren't as prevalent, but in terms of trying out brand new mechanics or archetypes that technically existed before but were unplayably bad before that were now maybe playable, that was still kind of off limits to me, which was a bit of a disappointing reality, but I realized it was probably going to be like this. Then again, considering I was going to begin my humble journey from Silver League, I would have plenty of games to just mess around where I wouldn't really have to sweat to make progress. So I took the opportunity to just stick with the decks completely unaltered that I already had before the update and see what I thought about them. Honestly, usually I would get straight into deck building, but again, with my limited resources, it felt like I didn't know what to do yet without having some idea of what people were really playing out there. I feel like I needed to play some games with the decks I already had to get an idea of how they've been positively and negatively affected by the nerfs, and get some kind of idea of what direction I actually want to go in before I make any decisions. And unfortunately, a very predictable but very disappointing outcome came to light pretty quickly. Despite the nerfs, Solar Flare Aggro was still the best deck I had by far. Solar Flare Aggro got hit pretty bad in terms of nerfs, but there's also so many cards that can go in the aggro deck that you can very easily drop the cards that got nerfed for cards that didn't. Not to mention, most of the cards that got nerfed simply went down from 2 to 1 health, which isn't inconsequential, but they still do just as much damage as they did before if they don't die. And a lot of the times, the difference between the 1 and 2 health is mostly only relevant against beastly heroes that spam nibble at you. Aside from those -1/-1 effects, for the most part, it kind of just feels like the same card. Not to mention, while it's only 2 cards that Solar Flare Aggro loves to use got massively buffed, and even though the nerfs far outnumber the buffs, I think that the buffs might actually outweigh the nerfs, even though there are much fewer of them. Those being that Wildberry got Anti-Hero 2, making it a 2-cost card that can take up a third of your health bar on turn 2, just because you weren't able to block it for a single turn. That is devastating to be able to do to someone as an aggro deck. And Laser Beam now has less health, but gets more attack based on the amount of sun you've made, making it an even more effective finisher to play towards. Not to mention, just generally, when it comes to how the classes as a whole are looking after the end of this update, I feel like Guardian is the class that got hit the hardest, followed by Mega Grow. And Smarty's doing okay, Solar's doing okay, and Kabloom's probably the only class that outright just feels better. Given the fact that Solar Flare happens to share two of the classes that are actually surviving the nerfs pretty well, it just becomes true that despite the fact that Aggro Solar Flare was targeted probably more than just about any other plant deck other than Tempo Grass Knuckles, Aggro Solar Flare still reigns supreme. And as much as that's technically good news for budget players, I was a bit disappointed at first. I mean, it's technically rehashing the same old when I wanted to show you something new. But I did get a chance to show you something new. Because as I reached Diamond League, I realized, hang on a minute, Aggro Solar Flare's dropping off. Maybe it wasn't as good as I thought. Maybe just these low-rank opponents weren't running the kind of counterplay to be able to shut down the deck, and now that I was getting into Diamond League, I was seeing a lot more opponents that had the tools to survive what I was dishing out. Especially because around this time, I saw an absolutely enormous surge of Rustbolt players. I don't know if everyone else experienced this, but genuinely, the entire way from like rank 30 to rank like 43-ish, it was basically nothing but Rustbolt opponents. Between being able to heal for 6 as one of his powers, having Shrink Ray as another one, and having a Chop as a third one, which could often delete your laser beams that would have been your big finishes, this guy is impossible to kill as an Aggro Solar Flare player. And so I had to change and adapt, something I actually really welcomed. And the strangest thing was, when it came time to adapt, I spent some time just playing around with other decks that weren't even meant to be good, it was just to get quests done. And it turned out that a Citron Beam deck I had made suddenly became my most successful deck, which was kind of shocking. I didn't even really make it to be super optimized, it was just I had quests to play beans, so I made a bean deck with just every bean I owned. Filled in the gaps with a bunch of general good stuff from the two classes Citron has at his disposal, Smarty and Guardian, and I called it a day. And already this deck that wasn't really made to be optimized was doing pretty good actually. This definitely caught my interest, so I decided to delete the deck and remake it with the same sort of idea, but this time make it a real deck. And this is how you get to what you see on screen now. Budget Countertron. A mix between a bean deck, an amphibious aggro deck, and, of course, Countertron. A deck that's entirely based around ripping away the zombies' opportunity to have last say. I'll get more into it later, but long story short, zombies almost always want to have last say through the use of tricks or gravestones. This deck runs lots of anti-trick cards, and it's supposed to run a lot of anti-gravestone cards too. So no matter what they decide to do to try and get last say, you always get to punish them for trying, and they don't get a chance to take control of the game. You're in control of the game. The only way they can take control and potentially win is to accept that they won't get last say, and instead just focus on playing high-tempo big stats onto the board, knowing that you're going to be able to react to everything they get to do, but just hoping they have enough stats they can break through anyway. And don't get me wrong, this is still the best way to counterplay the deck you're seeing on screen now, but even then this deck has tricks up its sleeve. Between the Sham Rockets, the Pear Cubs, and the Doom Shrooms, if you get the right hand, you can absolutely destroy these decks still, even the ones that are the best equipped to counter you. The main problem is just that the cards you can use to counter these decks that do have bigger stats are the kind of things you can't run too many of, otherwise the deck will start to fall apart. And sometimes you can just not draw them, in which cases, yeah, you tend to lose those games. Even if you just go up against something like a basic budget sports deck that's just putting good stats on the board, if you don't get one of your Doom Shrooms to nuke their board when it starts getting out of control, you're probably losing that game. But if you even draw just one, that turns into a winning game. Throughout my trek through the drudges of Diamond League, where it was non-stop Rustbolt after Rustbolt, even into early Taco League, this deck served me well. It was doing extremely well. By the time I got to Taco League, I knew I was going to be making this video on this deck, and so I decided it was time I started actually counting wins and losses so I'd have some stats to present you with. But all I could say was before that point, I was definitely winning a lot. Now, early on in Taco League, the win streak continued, until it started to struggle a bit. I started seeing some different opponents. Still saw a few Rustbolts for a bit, but definitely a lot more generally just tempo-based heroes, a lot of hearty, a lot of crazy, a lot of beastly. And these decks were not the kind of things I was expecting to run into on the ladder. And they were doing very well against my deck. These were the decks I was talking about. that just wanted to get big stats on the board fast, and if I didn't draw my Doom Shrooms at the right time, I just kinda had to lose. Not to mention a lot of these decks were also incorporating Untrickable, so in those cases, Doom Shroom wouldn't even save me. By the time I hit my 50th game with this deck, I was 30-20. A 60% win rate, but my win rate was a lot higher earlier on in the ranks. Still, I was content with 60. However, by the time I hit my 50th game, the reason I stopped counting is already by that point, I got the feeling, I don't want to be playing this deck anymore. All the opponents I'm against now are not the kind of thing this deck is made to be. I'm losing these games, but it's not even like I didn't realize I was going to lose them. The second I realize what I'm up against, it's like, okay, either I draw Doom Shroom or I lose. And I would run more copies of Doom Shroom, but I'd already lost a stupid amount of games because even though I'm only running 2 Doom Shrooms, I'd keep drawing both of them in games where I had 0 targets to Doom Shroom. So I couldn't just run more Doom Shrooms to fix this problem. Again, not to mention the Untrickable cards Doom Shroom wouldn't even be able to address. Unfortunately, at the time I thought to myself that it would probably be better if I kept the video focused on just one deck, so I tried to force it. Even believing that this deck was probably no longer the best deck to use, I continued using it for a bit and very quickly realized I should have gone with my gut. Because past the 50 game mark, I did lose 8 in a row. Up to you whether you count those or not, knowing that I kind of thought they weren't the best already going in. But yeah, after 8 losses in a row, I got the message. Screw having a coherent video with one clear focus. I just need to win some damn games. So it was back to the drawing board. Well, kind of. Actually, we didn't really have to reinvent ourselves or anything. We just had to go back to what we were already doing with some slight tweaks. You see, for a time, I tried to tweak the deck into being a slightly more aggressive deck that generally did the same things, but ultimately, I experienced basically no change in the win rate. But before I go to what we went to next, I need to explain why this deck started losing. Because at first, it probably seems a lot like, well, it's just not good enough. Maybe it was better than you expected. Maybe it did really, really well in Diamond League. It came out the gate swinging with lots and lots of wins, but when it gets to the cream of the crop, it just doesn't cut it, I guess. You've all been clickbaited. This deck isn't good enough to get to rank 50. I'm sorry. But of course, I'm a bit skeptical of that. I understand that it all lines up nicely, especially because something that I did do to make this challenge even harder on myself was make sure to begin the challenge at the beginning of a new competitive season. I still would like the idea that for the people who are really here listening to everything I'm saying, you know I'm not making any excuses or giving myself any unfair advantages. And I do honestly think that doing this at the end of a season when a lot of high-ranked players aren't playing anymore or are just playing meme decks would not really be very honest. And while it's certainly the case that doing the exact opposite, hard grinding at the beginning of a season, probably is a little bit harder than it needs to be, at the same time, I'm doing this for the sake of having a new challenge to beat in this game. I want the challenge, so I'm happy to take on the extra burden. Or at least I thought I would be. Because I didn't think all too much about it. I just thought to myself, I will pre-select for more difficult opponents by hard grinding right at the beginning of the season so that my rank is inflated compared to other people's ranks that I'll be running into, which will be deflated. As a result, my matchmaking will be more brutal, and that'll make the challenge more honest. But here's where it all went wrong. I had pre-selected for something else in all of my opponents besides just the fact that they would be higher skill level opponents by doing this. I had actually pre-selected that the high skill opponents I'd be facing would be practically running nothing but aggro decks in Taco League because of the conditions I had set up. Plenty of these Rustbolts I saw in Diamond, while not all of them, were Ultimate League players. They had the Ultimate League badge that showed they were ranked 50 from the last season. They just only started playing their ranked games now, whereas I had already been grinding for a few days beforehand. I was doing fine against Ultimate League players in general, but it was the Ultimate League players that were grinding their way back to rank 50 ASAP that I had a problem with. Because if you want to grind your way back to Ultimate League, and you're on an account that already gets Ultimate League almost every season, so you just want to get back there quick, you don't really care about it, it's not special to you, you've gotten it before, what deck are you going to use to get back there ASAP? I'll give you a hint, it's not going to be like an OTK Valk deck, or like a Control Immorticia deck, unless you're doing it for pure fun reasons. If you want to get to rank 50 ASAP, regardless of whether it is the highest win rate deck you have, you want to play Aggro. As long as the win rate is high enough that you're winning more games than you're losing, and the games are lightning fast because your deck is so aggressive and goes all in on risk and reward right from the beginning, meaning that you either lose immediately or win immediately, then you get faster games. And even if your win rate might be 2 percentage points lower with your aggro deck compared to your control deck, who cares? Your games are 3 times faster, you're going to climb the ranks much faster, you keep playing that deck. So you see where this is going now, don't you? Bearing in mind that the highest rank you can begin at the start of a new season is rank 30 if you were a rank 50 player, that means that only about a week into a new season, at the very, very top, from rank 40 to 50, there are not going to be a lot of players. The only people in that rank are going to be the hard grinding sweats. And again, I did pre-select for those knowingly, thinking that all I was going to get was more difficult opponents. But I forgot that I had to also consider that they would grind faster and reach a higher rank quicker with aggressive decks and only aggressive decks. Again, because of the amount of games I grinded for the sake of this video, there really weren't a lot of players even in Taco League yet from what I could see from my games. A lot of the players I was getting, even when I made it to Taco League myself, were people who used to be in Ultimate League or Taco League, but were currently stuck in Gold or Diamond still because they just hadn't played their games yet. Now, I will just add one thing here. While I do fully believe everything I said, and I don't think it's cope, I will be a little bit fair. It could also be true that these decks are genuinely really good into the meta. I could believe that. I think that mid-range Chompzilla, which is doing quite well right now, would probably have a good matchup into these decks. Mid-range tends to do pretty good against aggro so long as it has heal, and mid-range Chompzilla does have heal. But other than that, I must admit, I imagine these aggro decks would run over almost all the meta plant decks right now. Aggro destroys OTK decks and combo decks, so they go out the window for the plants. Goodbye OTK Grass Knuckles, and goodbye Captain Combustible. And I don't know if Cycle Cap's still around because I haven't seen much of it, but theoretically goodbye that deck as well. But how will Nightcap and Rose's control decks fare? Well, this is why when you see this diagram that I'm using in the video, I've used it before when talking about undercards. I personally like to include mid-range in this diagram. A lot of people cut out mid-range in this chart for the sake of simplicity, but the main problem with that is that if you do that, you have to say that control is what counters aggro, and I just don't think that's correct. I think they have a neutral matchup, in that when control gets the right tools to shut down aggro, then it's devastating. However, aggro gives control so few turns to actually get the tools they need to shut down the aggressive deck that oftentimes you can still have a really, really tough time dealing with aggro decks as control. I think they're even. I think mid-range is a better way to counter aggro. And I bring this up to say, the only thing you need to do to an aggro deck to make it counter control as well is to include some kind of anti-control tools in the deck. Even just a couple of them is enough to usually make your deck devastating versus any control deck. Like, I don't know, Untrickable. And haven't I just been saying that I've been seeing Untrickable everywhere now? So yeah, I do think these aggro decks are also smart because of the fact that I do think it's mostly just mid-range Chompzilla when it comes to popular plant decks right now that actually has a chance against it. Most other decks do play right into its hand. I must admit, when I made this Countertron deck, I thought it would do a lot better because of the fact that I've been working on this deck for a while now, and back when I first started working on it, the idea was I bet there'll be a lot of Brainy Heroes, a lot of Professor Brainstorms using Quarterly Bonus, and this deck will deal with that very well, which it did. This deck was great against Quarterly Bonus, and that is the new strongest card that the zombies have gotten. But of course, now this is sort of the next step along, where obviously plants are running anti-Quarterly Bonus cards, so the zombies are doing the response to that, which are these aggro decks. So yeah, I certainly give in that to some extent this is just due to the instability of the meta, causing my deck to become a bit outdated within the space of only a few weeks. Quite simply, the kind of opponents I was expecting to run into with a deck like this just were not anywhere to be seen on the ladder. And while part of that is due to the way that I pre-selected for opponents that would counter me, it's also partially due to the fact that maybe people realized that everyone's going to counter the obvious strong stuff on the zombies anyway. But now that you have the full picture, that although this deck was well built to counter many different deck archetypes, the one archetype it couldn't beat was the one archetype I was pre-selecting for. Now that you understand that, you might be thinking, well, how do I beat it? I mean, the only thing that I said I think would be good for beating it would be mid-range. But the problem is, all the budget mid-range cards got nuked. The only good mid-range cards left in the game are practically all legendaries. So that's just not even an option for a budget player. How on earth am I supposed to make it through the rest of these ranks without using legendaries when legendary spam in the mid game is basically the only thing that seems to be capable of beating these kind of boards? Well, what if I didn't have to beat their board to win? Now you might be thinking, oh, so you mean kill them over the top? But isn't that like a burn or an OTK strategy? Don't you say that aggro counters those? If these decks I was going against were getting onto the board so intensely in speed that oftentimes they had a board state from which it was basically impossible to recover and win the game by turn 4, what if I could construct an aggro deck on the plants which was so ludicrously aggressive it would secure a board state from which you would almost certainly win on turn 3? All I needed to do was be 1 turn faster to the punch. Oh yeah, we went full circle, all the way back to Aggro Solar Flare, but with a twist. Now don't get me wrong, Aggro Solar Flare is a very fast deck, especially if you're running stuff like Haunted Pumpkins. I don't happen to own any, unfortunately, but probably would run them if I had them. But as fast as it is, having a winning board state by turn 3, that's a bit of a tall order. Could Aggro Solar Flare really pull that off? Especially after all the nerfs? Well, yes. Yes, it can. And you don't even necessarily need a bunch of good cards. You don't need Pine Clones, although I do have one in my collection, so I threw one in the deck. You don't need Velociraptors, but if you have them, put them in, they're really good. No, what if I told you the only things you really need to make this deck work are Wildberry, Shroom for 2, Bush Shroom, Push Shroom, and any good strike-through finishers, whether it be Astrocardos, Elderberries, or Laser Beans. In this case, all 3, because I happen to own some of all 3 of those. Though probably out of those 3, in this deck the best one is Laser Beam. This is going to just help to further reinforce my point of the issue being a matchup issue rather than a skill issue. What was super infuriating about losing to all these decks I was fighting is that there were so many things these decks were missing that you could easily punish them for not running. I just wasn't the kind of deck that would punish them for not running these contingencies. And so, yeah, I found it infuriating losing so many games I knew I could have won if I just had something to punish the obvious mistakes this guy was making. But at the end of the day, I don't have those cards in my deck, and I can't put those cards in my deck without completely changing what the deck is. And ultimately, I know it's not stupidity on the part of people who make these aggro decks that they don't include these contingencies. If they did, it would slow down their pace, and these decks clearly want to be fast above all else. But even still, it was kind of infuriating to deal with. So the answer is, you punish them for not running those contingencies, and that's exactly what this deck does. Can I be real with you? As powerful as this deck is, and as much as I do think this is a decent deck, this was an experiment I was willing to try, but I didn't truly believe it would work at first. I thought it made logical sense, but I thought, nah, this deck is just so stupid, so greedy, so dumb. There is no way this deck will actually succeed at top ranks. Like, this is literally like going back to when the game was new, like old-fashioned Mushroom synergy, without even Punish Shroom, because it's too slow. We're unironically running Berry Angry, for God's sake, and we're running 4 0 drops. My god, man, we are gonna get so many dead hands. We're gonna have so many games where we are nuked and lose the entire game off of 1 Acid Rain, off of 1 Eclipse, off of 1 Weed Spray, off of 1 Chickening, off of 1 Plumber, off of 1 fucking Conga. Practically every plant in this goddamn deck has 1 HP. There are so many mass plant clear cards that will ruin us, even just Extinction Event, especially if we play our Pine Clone, but even if we don't play our Pine Clone, against all the push shrooms, it might nuke our board. All that on top of the RNG required to even get a good hand in the first place, at least not being too bad, but still being a little bit, you know, erratic. Surely there is no way this deck could consistently perform and beat out the top ranked players. How many games did we lose with this deck? Oh, only 19. Is that because we played less games than with the Countertron deck? No. Do you want to know how many games I won with this deck? 48. That is a 72% win rate with a budget deck at the top ranks in early season. Now you might be thinking, you found the secret code, you found the best budget deck of all time, and it's, oh yeah, it's Aggro Solar Flare. But at least it's a Mushroom variant, but yeah, not all that surprising, it's Aggro Solar Flare. And don't get me wrong, obviously this deck did overperform, it did really, really well, and that's good. But as a show of fairness, and that I really do mean what I said earlier, It goes both ways. I think that just as I feel like the win rate of the Citron deck got deflated by the fact that we were running into so many aggro decks, I think the opposite is happening here, where because this deck is abusing the fact that no one is slowing down for even a second to run any of the multiple cards that would nuke our deck, because they're just going too fast to bother with running any contingencies. They just gotta keep going. That is exactly why this deck experienced so much success. If I went back to seeing a bunch of Rustbolts halfway through playing this deck, I think I would lose, because they'd be running Weed Spray, and one Weed Spray would end my entire career. There would be no recovering from that. This deck does not have the resources to recover from a single damn acid rain even. But as I said, I knew all too well at this point. I'd seen way too many people just running brain dead aggro that it's like, I know you're not going to have those cards. You could easily put them in and beat me, but I know you're not going to do it. You're too invested in getting fast games. Fine, I'll show you a fast game. I'll show you even faster than what you've been doing. I'll show you what it looks like when I have a full board on turn 2. Now, I haven't explained much of how you play this deck so far, just because it's not all that deep, although it is slightly different from what you're used to. Typical aggro solar flare is just kind of play for the board and hit face. And don't get me wrong, this is similar. You do play for the board and you do hit face a lot. But with this deck in particular, you need to understand something. Basically, almost every time you play this deck, you will have one big pop-off turn. And it will usually be turn 3, but if you get a lucky hand, it might even be turn 2. This big pop-off turn is going to be the point at which you secure a board state from which it is extremely difficult for the enemy player to recover. Now, I've been careful whenever I'm talking about these aggressive decks to say that you secure a winning board state, not a win. And that's important to understand because you might be thinking, if this deck's object is to effectively win the game by turn 3, why the hell am I running so many expensive 4, 5, and 6 cost strike-through cards? Well, the answer is, half the time you will just unironically win on turn 3 or 4. But sometimes, because of the fact that they are also building a fast board, they will eventually trade into your plants and at least stall or maybe survive even. However, it doesn't matter if they do that if you also have strike-through. Because bearing in mind you're taking off a third of their health bar on turn 2 with Wildberry, and if you're not doing that, you've got a massive board full of 2/2 Pushrooms on turn 2 with Bushroom, and if you're not doing that, you're hitting them with a Berry Angry on a full board on turn 3, no matter what happens, even if by turn 4 or 5 you lose the board, you still will have your opponents somewhere in the ballpark of 5 HP remaining. Which means 1 Elderberry, 1 Astrocardo, 1 Laser Beam, and it's curtains. And so they can play a couple extra turns before they know they're dead, but the second they see that big strike through, they know they're dead. And there's nothing they can really do to stop it. I mean, I say that, they could bungee it, they could rocket science it, but again, remember, the whole point of this deck is to screw over the people who aren't running any contingencies and are just purely playing for board. The people who are purely playing for board will have no response to strike through. So hopefully you understand what I mean when I say this deck shouldn't have won as much as it did. In fact, remember that we were actually starting to get middling results with Solar Flare aggro as low as Diamond League. And in part that was because of the unusual quantity of Rustbolts down there. And while that definitely hurt, I still think that even outside of Rustbolts, I was losing games because people were simply playing smart and running the tools to shut me down. But again, ironically, of all places at the top ranks, because people were playing for speed rather than the optimal decks, they weren't running anything that could shut down any of my really counterable, really greedy plays. That's why this deck just embraces the greed of it all. Everything in this deck is all risk and all reward, and in any sane meta, this should get obliterated by tricks. But no one's running them, at least not at the top. So I just want to quickly take this moment to acknowledge the fact that ultimately, right now as plants, especially as a budget player, you are not focused on deck power level. Try and get out of that frame of thinking that my deck has to hit a certain general strength level. It is much more about looking at how the zombies win, what sacrifices they have to make to get their win con, and how you can punish them for making those sacrifices. Like I said, the Citron deck that kicked off this journey was to punish people for running quarterly bonus as their win con, or punish them for running other trick-heavy playstyles like Controlling Morticia, which used to be a bit more popular at the start of this new meta, or just generally any deck that wants to hit face with teleports like the new buffed Super Brains decks. And of course, that's why the deck eventually dropped off, because it was made to beat those opponents, and while it could beat a lot of other ones on the side, the main thing it lost to ended up being the #1 thing I kept running into. And so there's no point on insisting on continuing to use the wrong tool for the job, You just swap tools. If, like me, you get this high and you have the same experience where you start losing tons of games because everyone's playing stupidly aggressive decks with 0 tricks and 0 responses to any risky, high attack, low HP plant, then just pivot to this kind of deck type. That being said, I didn't want to ruin the fun. I didn't want to hit rank 50 with a Solar Flare deck. This was all about Citron, damn it. And so I reworked the deck one last time. I came back to make a much more aggressive version of the Citron deck. I had already tried to do this a little bit, but I was too half-hearted before. Now that I saw how much more effective I could be by playing so much faster against the kind of opponents I was running into, I was going all in this time. Taking a lot of parts out of the deck I would have hesitated to before, knowing full well that all that mattered was to be able to play faster while still being able to go with this general game plan. Already, when I was trying to do it before, I decided to craft 2 Marine Beans and 2 Bog of Enlightenments, which I obviously put into this new aggressive variant. We're even running Pair Pals here, and they're surprisingly good cards in this particular deck. Long story short, due to plants losing a lot of other tempo options, Amphibious Aggro is unironically pretty good right now. And while that was always an aspect of the deck, it was certainly a smaller aspect in previous iterations of the deck, but in this iteration, the Amphibious Aggro is front and center. So for my last set of games to get from rank 49 to rank 50, I decided to run only Citron, running this exact deck you see on screen. And obviously not as many games were played as a result, but in the end it went 7-2. And that is how I reached Ultimate League, using only budget plants. In the meta, more punishing to budget plants than probably any meta we've ever had before, which is kind of my new crowning achievement in this game. I even managed to do it within 2 weeks of the season starting. Which, to be fair, maybe I could have done it faster, but I was already grinding pretty hard. I didn't want to really no-life the game, if I'm completely honest. With all that said, I know I kept you waiting, but let me explain the rationale between this Citron deck. I know it's been on screen for a while, and I haven't gotten into it. It's just that once we start getting into this, it's a long vortex of different considerations and different reasons why this is here and this is there, and I kind of wanted to get the story out and straight before we get into this sort of mess of cards. Because it is quite the web of different important things to know. So, I believe it's time to answer. How the hell did this piece of trash get us to rank 50? Well, I must admit, this is definitely where I bring a unique perspective that I think tends to go against the common knowledge of the community. Well, I think when most people talk about making budget decks, they make stuff like sports decks. I mean, sports decks have been kind of the mainstay, the #1 sort of budget deck on the zombie side for a long, long time. So let's use that as an example. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't to say that sports decks are bad at all. But here's the thing about telling people to play sports decks as a budget player. It might work, but it's going to be a rough journey if you're trying to get all the way to rank 50 on a free-to-play account using a sports deck. And it's not even necessarily because, oh, it's just because you're a budget player and you've got a worse collection, so you're playing at a disadvantage, but you can still get there. Well, you can still get there, but it's more something else. Something that I wonder how much people really think about, I suppose. But you really got to pay attention to where skill starts and luck ends in card games, because that's actually a pretty blurry line. I mean, the very order you draw your cards in is complete RNG and massively, completely can alter the outcome of each of your games. To a large extent, you're at the whims of luck in card games, which I think that much people understand, but then people still understand there's skill in there somewhere, and so people just kind of generally nebulously think, oh, that's because, like, you get good at the game and you make smart decisions with the cards you have, and yeah, you do good. But a lot of times exactly how this skill manifests is something that I feel like people are very vague and incoherent about. Honestly, when it comes to most decks that are made to do one thing and one thing only, and don't really have the tools to switch game plans, there isn't actually a lot of room for skill expression. A lot of it really is just luck. And the thing is, that is most decks in most card games, full stop. A lot of optimized decks will just plan to do one thing as well as possible and hope it works. And if they find themselves in a matchup where that one thing isn't a way they can realistically win the game, tough luck. And don't get me wrong, there is some skill, especially in decks that go longer into the game, in optimizing how to play each turn with those decks, but at the end of the day, you don't have to think about what your end goal is. You know what your end goal is. And so, while that is nice because it makes the deck simple to pilot, it also means you're imposing an unnecessary skill ceiling on yourself. If you're playing a deck with only one game plan, your skill limit is essentially how much you can optimize that game plan. Stuff like picking the correct lanes to put your zombies in, picking the correct targets for your effects, etc. And again, honestly, when it comes to these things, you honestly don't usually have a lot of options, and there isn't a lot of freedom to choose to decide what you want to do. And so while there often will be choices, there won't be that much room to make a big difference through pure skill. And that's an issue. You gotta remember, if you're playing a budget deck, the logic is you know you are playing at a disadvantage. If you're trying to win with budget decks, the logic is, hey, my deck should not win. My deck is supposed to be disadvantaged, but I am hoping that I am either luckier or more skillful than the opponent, and I'll win anyway. And considering that luck is out of our control, we'd like to think we're more skillful than our opponent, and that's why we can pull it off. But again, that makes it so that I actually think it's quite questionable to make budget decks where essentially you're still trying to make decks the same way, with lots of consistency and lots of copies of the same thing, all trying to do one thing as well as possible, despite the fact that you know you can't do it as well as possible. You don't have the collection to do this game plan as well as it possibly can do. What's the point in trying to play a really good tempo deck and have no tools to do anything else if you know, because you have a limited collection, you're not going to be able to make the best tempo deck? It not only means that you lose to the kind of things that are going to beat tempo decks anyway, but it also means whenever you run into another tempo deck, you're not favored to win. Even though you both got the same game plan, they have a collection and you don't. So hopefully you are able to follow all that. This is why this deck, similar to my last deck I reached Ultimate League with, my Wall Knight deck, also looks like a complete mess. Because both of these decks play to multiple outs, multiple win conditions. And that's where the extra skill expression comes in. That's where the extra room to simply be better at the video game comes in a game that's usually mostly down to luck. And don't get me wrong, luck still plays a huge factor. You can get screwed with this deck. I experienced it plenty already. But I do believe these messy decks, quote unquote, honestly have more room to win purely based on a skill differential than just about any other deck type out there, even more seriously constructed decks. So that's why this deck kind of has three synergies going on at once. It's got this sort of Amphibious aggro package alongside a Countertron package alongside a bean package. And this all fits together like clockwork because of a few things. First of all, it just so happens that most good beans are also amphibious, and even a lot of amphibious synergy cards are themselves beans, so the beans and amphibious are an easy fit together. The Countertron half, honestly, doesn't have a lot of obvious overlap, but it mostly comes down to a couple things. First of all, despite running 4 Admiral Navy Beans, Navy Bean isn't actually a very good 1-drop, even though it costs 1. So you want to run a lot of 1s in this deck. We need more room for 1s, so there goes the Forget-Me-Nots, a super important card for any Countertron deck. Beyond that, in a deck like this, Sporticus, believe it or not, works great with beans, despite not being one. Because usually the main downside of Sporticus is, despite being good stats and an anti-trick card, something that would usually make you amazing, in other decks Sporticus sometimes falls flat because of the fact that 2 damage isn't a massive threat to most people, and so they'll just tank the 2 damage and ignore the Sporticus. But in a deck that can already kill you over the top with beans, taking 2 extra damage you didn't need to take from Sporticus is often the difference between life and death. And so Sporticus actually becomes a big threat that the opponent is genuinely scared of, only because the bean package also exists in the deck. Not to mention that beans and amphibious happen to fit nicely into this picture because of the simple fact that, well, most people don't run amphibious zombies. Like, I know that they exist, but like, can you think of right now a popular amphibious zombie that a lot of people are running? The only amphibious zombie I've been seeing anyone playing is I've been seeing some people play Toxic Waste Imp. Other than that, the water lane has been empty basically all of my games, which leaves them wide open to attack from there. And now in fairness, this, while it's particularly intense right now, isn't all that new. We have seen zombies not running amphibious cards for a while now. It's usually compensated for by the fact they can simply play tricks to kill whatever's in the water. But that's just the thing. This is an anti-trick deck. Not to mention, some of these amphibious minions are really sticky and hard to take out with just tricks. Putting this all together provides you a powerful game plan for one simple reason. We can win at any point in the game. If we get a nice, lucky opening hand where we can play amphibious aggro, or just get a bunch of good stats on the board real early, then that means that we can just win super early. Lovely. Only problem with that is that naturally, being an aggressive strategy, it's luck-based. Now, what we would usually do at this point is we would optimize the deck to make the chances of getting the lucky hand as high as possible. But instead of doing that, we just set it up so that it's possible to get a lucky hand. But if we don't, we use the remaining card slots instead of trying to improve the odds on instead giving a backup plan. The next backup plan being, okay, Amphibious Aggro didn't work out, we're going to lean further into Countertron and try and win in the mid game by simply leaving the opponent so disabled in that all their gravestones and tricks are just completely unusable, to the point where hopefully we can get a kill around turn 4 or 5 with something like a particularly nasty leaf blower or a big Brainana play. But if all else fails, if you are dragged into the late game kicking and screaming, at that point, you can no longer fight for the board for the most part. Against most decks, past turn 6, this deck will lose the board and there's nothing you can really do about it. The kind of cards that could wrestlers the board back are way too expensive for this deck to be able to afford it. We don't have Dark Matter Dragon Fruits, we don't have Soul Patches, we only have the cards we have here. And so, rather than trying to win the traditional way of just surviving a long time and playing big things to win in the late game, we win by killing over the top. A term you don't hear as much because it's not a super common deck archetype, but essentially it shifts into a burn deck. Sort of like an OTK deck, but instead of killing in one turn, you're constantly hitting the opponent in the face with unpreventable damage, which doesn't kill them in one turn, but the fact that there's no way for them to stop it and it keeps happening continuously means eventually they will die and there'll be nothing they can do to stop it from happening. And of course, beans are one of the few examples of a burn deck you can run in PvZ Heroes. That is the secret to this deck's success, is that it's an aggro deck that when it doesn't get the lucky hand it needs, converts into a mid-range deck, which if it still doesn't manage to win in the mid-game, converts into a burn deck that kills over the top, hopefully before a control deck that you might be up against that might take you to the late game could eke out a win with something like a Zombot. And the reason this gives so much more skill expression to your deck and a much more potential to win based on being the better player is not only because a lot of these cards are catered around you denying the opponent's cards, and so being able to read your opponent's mind, know what's in their hand based on the classes they're playing, the deck that you think that they're running, the way they're playing the game. Those kind of skills could come in real handy with this deck, because knowing what your opponent's hand is gives you the maximum opportunity to counter it. But beyond that, knowing what win condition you're playing to massively changes the decisions you make. The best decision to win based on an aggressive strategy is going to be a completely different decision than the best way to win using the burn strategy. And so on a matchup to matchup basis, you have to be able to decide, okay, this person's playing this hero, they're most likely running this deck with this object, this sort of win condition. Given that that's the win condition I have to play against, which of the multiple win conditions that I have is the most likely to pan out? They're going to force you into the late game as an Immorticia control deck, kill them over the top with beans. You're up against Rustbolt OTK All-Star and you're going to die the second they get their combo? Well, you better play fast then. Hard mulligan for an aggressive hand and try and close out a kill as fast as possible. For the most part, no matter what your opponent's running, you have an out to play to. Even the decks that counter this, the aggressive decks that are just too fast for it, as I've already mentioned, there are cards you can get which can flip the outcome here. It's just the fact that they can't be all too plentiful, as I already mentioned. You get the general picture by now, but to call out some specific cards, the reason we're running Citron specifically rather than Beta Carotina, besides the fact that I don't own Beta Carotina on this account, is mostly because of the fact that Citron's powers are all amazing with Forget-Me-Not, except for Mog. Unless you roll Mog as your starting power, you'll almost always, if you play Forget-Me-Nots on 1, get something to play on 2 to make it invincible or put a walnut in front of it, meaning that the Forget-Me-Nots will almost always live to turn 3. And even if it finally dies on turn 3, guess what turn you're playing Sporticus? Alright, turn 3. Photosynthesizer just takes this even further, obviously being amazing to combo with Forget-Me-Nots as usual. Mars Flytrap in this deck is also not a meme. If you haven't actually used this card, it's genuinely really good. Genuinely. I mean it. This card's amazing. To put it in perspective, Galacticactus in the Guardian class was one of the best 1-drops in the game before its nerf, and even still now is considered pretty good. And that was a 1-cost 2/2 bullseye. And sure, it had the on-death ability, but honestly, that wasn't that good. Sometimes it even sabotaged you. I mean, especially considering even decks that ran Forget-Me-Nots, which Galacticactus would kill, would still run Galacticactus just for a 1-cost 2/2 bullseye. Then think about the fact that Mars Flytrap is basically a 1-cost 2/2 bullseye, with no downside. Obviously, it's not quite as good as Bullseye because they can still block, but it does also have the upside of charging your own block meter while sucking away from theirs. The only reason you don't see much more of Mars Flytrap is because Lima Plurdon exists, and is one of the most broken 1-drops in the game. Obviously, obviously, why the hell would you run Mars Flytrap if you already own 4 copies of Limapleurodon? You're just going to use Limapleurodon every time. But we don't have that luxury. And so I think the second you take Limapleurodon out of the picture, Mars Flytrap becomes a great contender for the Smarty class's potentially best one-drop aside from Limapleurodon. Virus is obviously just more Amphibious synergy, replace it with a Limapleurodon if you have one. Cosmic Bean does kind of suck to have to run in this deck, but you do need as many beans as you can get to get the over-the-top damage to kill with, and so a bean that gives you another bean is pretty valuable. And at the very least, it does make for a good evolution target. I wasn't running Blockbuster at this moment, not because I didn't want it, but because I didn't own it yet, so I had to run Gravebuster. But I will say this deck is better with Blockbuster, and Cosmic Bean is an amazing Blockbuster evolution target, being both a 1/1 that's cheap, but also being a team-up, meaning you can put it in more lanes. Juggernaut's just nice in this deck because it's not only good tempo, and it's not only a card that a lot of people own, even if it's a super rare, but on top of that, it kind of doubles as good for aggression because of Bullseye, and good for controlling the board because of Armored. Lightning Read obviously isn't great, but at least it got buffed recently to have 1 extra attack, which is certainly a lot better. We would just run loads of Laser Cattails in this slot, but I only owned 1. You can see we're really hurting in the 2-drop slot here. That was kind of the main cost slot where I didn't have any good cards on hand. Pear Cub, I only own 1 copy of, but if I owned more, I would probably sneak a couple more in. Pear Cub's really good against the big stat decks that usually beat this deck. Because of the fact that those big stat decks can't use tricks because of all the anti-trick stuff you have, and usually that's an advantage for them because your anti-trick stuff isn't countering them, but if they don't have tricks and they don't have gravestones, that means they're setting themselves up to easily get destroyed by a Pear Cub just fronting their big minions. Bean counter, unfortunately, is needed for the extra reach, but isn't really nice to have in the deck, it's just you need more beans. I'm kind of sad that I didn't own any cool beans. If I owned cool beans, I'd probably run more cool beans in this deck, and more marine beans as well. Of course, I crafted a couple eventually, but at this point I didn't have any. And maybe if you run Cool Bean and Marine Bean, you don't need to run as many bean counters and Cosmic Beans, but this is how it was for me at the time. I've skipped over a couple cards, but don't worry, I'm getting back to them. They're just the big ones to talk about. But I've already explained Doomshroom, I've already explained Brainana, obviously amazing to have. You don't need it, but it's really, really good if you have it. And Poppin' Poppies, I've already mentioned. I honestly think if anything was probably the weakest link in this deck by the time I got to the higher rank. So don't worry if you don't own Poppin' Poppies. I just thought it might be nice to have a card that extends our clock so we can live a few extra turns to get more chances to kill with beans. But in the end, a lot of the better opponents I was facing would just be able to kill me regardless of the heal. And it also made for a dead draw in a lot of situations that maybe I could have won if I didn't have so many dead cards in my hand. So honestly, I'd just replace Poppin' Poppies. Don't worry if you don't own it. But that brings me to the 2 spiciest cards in this deck, Planet of the Grapes and Leaf Blower. I did want to run at least 1 environment in this, and obviously Planet of the Grapes has great synergy with this deck. Not only because we got the classic beans in Planet of the Grapes to draw cards, which also helps look for more reach for more beans to get more damage over the top to get a kill, but also Sporticus, as usual, is good in Planet of the Grapes. Forget-Me-Nuts is even kind of good in it, because even though it doesn't have a way to hit the opponent directly, a lot of times it ends up getting to hit the opponent in really funny situations where they save just enough brains for tricks to kill it, and then the price just goes up by 1 and they can't kill it anymore and it gets a hit in. But lastly, it's to synergize with Leaf Blower. Okay, listen. I don't believe a single person on this planet other than me uses this card, and I want to change that. I really believe that Leaf Blower is an insane budget card with crazy potential that is insanely slept on. I mean, Jumping Bean is already a decent card. It's a 5-cost 3/2 bouncer zombie. This is a 4-cost 3/4 Amphibious bouncer zombie, which in fairness, of course, you can't put it in an environment and the water, and you don't get the bounce if you don't put it in an environment. Counterpoint. The main problem with this card in the first place, and the main reason why it's unpopular, is that the plants don't have any good environments anymore after all the nerfs. Especially now Spikeweed Sector sucks. That was kind of the last good environment they had left. It seemed, at least, for the most part. But, and it's not being run in this first iteration of the deck because I didn't own it yet, there is still 1 plant environment in the game, I would say, right now, that's still pretty good, that isn't super expensive, like Pear Paradise or Venus Flytrap Planet or something like that. I guess those environments are all right, but they're very, very greedy and expensive. When it comes to the 2, 3, 0 cost environments, because there's no 1 cost environments anymore, unfortunately, there's only 1 environment that actually got buffed rather than nerfed, and that is Bog of Enlightenment, only costing 2 when it used to cost 3. That wasn't this update, that was a bit ago, but even still. Bog of Enlightenment is a good environment that has continuously seen a slow uptick in usage and success ever since its buff years ago. And the more recent buffs have only made the Amphibious package even stronger. This into Bog of Enlightenment is a 5/4 for 4 that immediately removes a zombie of any size off the board. That is devastating, and the only condition is that it has to be played in environment. And here's how it gets even better. This card recently got buffed to also be able to bounce gravestones. So it doubles as well as extra backup gravestone removal if you don't have your blockbusters and your gravebusters on deck. And I know what you're thinking, okay, but this card sucks when it's a dead card, right? Well, obviously it's worse, but here's the best part. This card doesn't even suck when it's dead, because it's Amphibious. It is a 4-cost 3/4 Amphibious, and you might be like, okay, that's meh stats. I don't know, that's probably not going to cut it. But here's the thing. Bear in mind, no fucking zombie players right now are running any Amphibious zombies. The only Amphibious zombie anyone is sometimes running right now, in my experience, is Toxic Waste Imp. So other than that, which is basically just Super Brains and a couple huge Giganticuses that might be running that, even then, most of them are running Conjure decks instead. If 90% of players only can kill things in the water with tricks, how the hell do they deal with your Leaf Blower? Serious question. If they're a crazy hero, Bungee Plumber doesn't kill it. If they're Boogaloo, Lightning Bolt doesn't kill it. If they're Z-Mech, Missile Madness doesn't kill it. If they're Hearty, Rolling Stone doesn't kill it. If they're Brainy, Rocket Science doesn't kill it. Basically, the only 3 things that will deal with this are a big Amphibious minion, something that no one is running, a deadly Amphibious minion, something that only Imp decks are running, and Knockout, a card I had to look up the name of because I keep thinking this is still called Hand of Devastation from the beta before they changed the name. Side note, just had to get that out of my system. I genuinely don't even remember this ever being called Knockout, but it probably was. Hand of Devastation's a weird name to call this. Either way, you get the picture. Leaf Blower is a surprisingly sticky threat, and even if it's only 3 damage in the water lane that they can't prevent every turn, 3 damage off of their health bar every turn, they can't really sustain that if you've also got Beans and also got Sporticus for more over-the-top damage. Not to mention, against non-brainy heroes, you can further buff the stats of the Leaf Blower with your Navy Beans, ticking it up to a 4/5. And if that's going to be a problem because of Rocket Science, you can just hold it back. I know it's probably going to be a tough sell. At some point, I've got to make a full-on Leaf Blower deck, but I'm going to say this. This deck only had 2 Leaf Blowers, but the main reason why is because I only own 2. I really got to make a deck with 4 copies of Leaf Blower where Leaf Blower is actually a huge part of the deck at some point. I really got to prove all you guys wrong. Either way, yeah, Bog of Enlightenment is the ideal environment to put Leaf Blower into, but when Bog of Enlightenment isn't there, Planet of the Grapes will do, and it does happen to be a 3-drop that you play in preparation for a 4-drop, so it works on curve. And of course, bouncing a threat off the board leaves the lane open for Leaf Blower to draw you a card from Planet of the Grapes. Getting back to the environment itself though, Planet of the Grapes, long story short, I'm still mixed as to whether this is a decent environment to use here. I definitely know that Bog of Enlightenment is better, but whether you should run both Bog of Enlightenment and Planet of the Grapes like I did for a brief time where I ran 2 of each, or whether you should just run Bog of Enlightenment and ditch Planet of the Grapes if you have Bog of Enlightenment, I find that a bit hard to say. Long story short, Planet of the Grapes is a good card to have in your deck if you find in a lot of your games you're losing because you're forced into the late game and you just can't compete. Because if you have Planet of the Grapes, you can constantly hit them over the top with either Sporticus or Beans, use that to draw more cards to search for more Beans, and win the late game despite your disadvantage with over-the-top damage and card draw. But if you aren't even making it into the late game in most of your games, and if other people are playing even faster than you and running you over, then Planet of the Grapes sucks. It's a really slow and expensive dead draw in your hand that often gets you killed just for having it in the deck. So whether you should actually copy this and run Planet of the Grapes is really up to what you're experiencing. If your games are really slow right now, go ahead, run Planet of the Grapes. But if they're fast, you should probably only run Bog of Enlightenment. Now, naturally, as you probably expected, I moved to a more aggressive variant that did ditch the Planet of the Grapes eventually when I got to the higher ranks. And this is that version. Also, by this point, I'd finally obtained 2 copies of Blockbuster, so I subbed those in for the Gravebusters, as well as subbing in a couple Tricorns for our finishers, as they were much better options anyway, and that meant that I didn't have to go as hard on the Beans. It's still a Bean deck, but I didn't have to run Bean Counter anymore, which really helped this deck play a bit faster. Not to mention, we also got 2 copies of Marine Bean now, which is another bean we can use. Cool Bean would have also been a good option, I just still don't own any. You might even be looking questionably at the Pear Pals, but honestly, they were really good in this deck. They may just be 2-cost 2/2 Amphibious cards, but honestly, the only thing that feels bad is when they get plummered. And I'm not even seeing that many plumbers right now. A lot of the times, the fact they're team up is actually a big deal. There's so many Amphibious cards in this deck that you want to stack 2 things in the water, but often you've only got space for 1. So having Amphibious team ups is really nice. Not to mention, having team ups in general makes it easier to set up blockbusters. Speaking of blockbusters, there is one weirdo card in this deck that might catch you off guard, and that is Grave Mistake. If we're already running Leaf Blowers, which can now bounce gravestones, and we're already running 2 blockbusters, why do we need a Grave Mistake? Especially if this is the more aggressive variation of the deck. Aren't we more concerned with board presence than countering gravestones? Well, yeah, we are a little, but one of the most devastating cards for this deck to run into is Teleportation Zombie. Again, because a big strength of this deck was your ability to take away the opponent's ability to respond to what you were doing. The zombies never got last say because of all the countering you did. And the only way they could get last say without using a gravestone or a trick is Teleportation Zombie if you don't destroy the gravestone until it already pops out. You still can destroy it while it's still in the gravestone, but if you don't have gravestone removal on 2, it gets out the gravestone. And if it sticks on the board, a 1/5 is really, really tough for you to remove. But if you don't remove that 1/5, you're now no longer going to have last save for the rest of the game, even with all your anti-trick cards. So essentially, the one Grave Mistake is in here rather than a Grave Buster, because it's not even that you necessarily need to destroy the gravestone, you just need to make sure that they don't get a Teleportation Zombie down on curve. They can get a Teleportation Zombie down, but it can't be at a fast pace. And of course, the benefit of using Grave Mistake over Grave Buster is that if you're able to play it, it cycles itself for another card, which is very important in a deck like this, where all the cards are very cheap and you can empty your hand quite quickly. Just generally, if you miss your window to destroy a gravestone because there was only one window and it was before turn 4, the fact that this can just stall a gravestone and cycle itself until turn 4 when you can actually bounce it with Leaf Blower again or kill it with Blockbuster, that's very helpful. I very rarely find myself in the situation where a one-of feels optimal. It's often just a situation where one-ofs are just, I only own 1 copy of this, but here you go. But this is one of the few cases where I genuinely think 1 copy of this is best, because I tried running 2 for a bit, and it was just getting 2 of these in your hand at once. It happened way too many times, even though there was so few of them in the deck, and every time it would kill my hand and make the game unwinnable. Whereas just having 1 in my hand wasn't the end of the world. And to cap it off, the Solar Flare deck, but I'm not gonna lie, I'm mostly just gonna address 1 card here. Most of this is self-explanatory. You know how Solar Flare aggro works. This is a little bit different from normal Solar Flare aggro, but basically you got the general idea earlier when I explained it earlier in the video. So the main thing I just want to address is 1 weirdo card that might stick out to you in the Solar Flare deck that actually is in there for a very important reason, and that is Chomper. Chomper is weird to have here because it's already a niche card, and it's a niche card that's usually run in control decks, literally the opposite of aggro decks. Not to mention, most people tend to prefer to run Hammer. However, the reason why we're running Chomper specifically in the Solar Flare deck is because of 3 things. First of all, the main thing that counters this deck are high health, low attack zombies. The cards in particular I was seeing a lot of that would really make this deck cry were basically all brainy and sneaky cards. It was Dr. Space Time, Teleportation Zombie, and Parasol Zombie. Being able to instantly take one of these guys out and free up a lane in a deck that constantly wants to hit face like this and never have to take trades is a really, really big advantage to have. And while you could easily just run Hammer for that instead of Chomper and be able to hit any lane you like while doing it for cheaper, then you wouldn't get the 2/2 body. Why do you want the 2/2 body when it's only 2 damage for 1 extra sun? The other 2 reasons. First one being, this is a good evolution target for both Cro-Magnolia and on top of that Elderberry. But the third and probably most obscure reason, but actually quite important in my opinion, is that it will be very common with this deck that by turn 4, the opponent's block meter will be nearly full, and the next big hit you get on them will be blocked. And that can often negate your big Elderberry play, your big 6 damage from Wildberry to face. It's pretty common that you end up in a situation where your big hits get blocked and your little hits go through, letting the enemy survive. And you need to be able to manipulate the block meter to improve the odds that the enemy blocks early and gets hit by the big hit at the right time. The fact that Chomper is a cheap plant that will both put itself in a lane and potentially hit the enemy to trigger their block meter, as well as immediately remove whatever's in front of it, means it will almost always hit face when it's played. So even if it's only 2 damage, it doesn't matter if they're going to block it. Certainly if you're not having any of these issues, then you don't have to run Chomper, but I'm essentially running it here because it's playing around my lose conditions. Those being not being able to evolve my handful of elderberries, not being able to hit face because the enemy's just going to block and I could have won if I could just proc their block, and of course, getting screwed by big chunky units that trade well into my units. Chomper is just a solution to all 3 of those problems packed into 1 card, so it's surprisingly perfect for this deck. That said, that is how I reached rank 50 once again on my free-to-play account, with nothing but plants, doing quite possibly the most brutal meta in PvZ Heroes history for budget plants. Just a couple quick things I want to address to end this off. First of all, when I made that little compilation to tease this upcoming video, that video kind of popped off, which was a pleasant surprise, thank you very much. And as a result, it got a lot of comments, and a lot of people in the comments were bringing up Captain Combustible as their go-to choice. And sure, if you own Captain Combustible, that's not a bad idea. I just didn't want to show off Captain Combustible in this video for 2 reasons. 1, it's the same old, same old. I genuinely don't know if there is even anything different about how you play Captain Combustible right now compared to before the update, except maybe you might play Wildberry in his decks now. As usual, you just use Blazing Bark on Repeat Moss and win. But the other reason I didn't do Captain Combustible is because I feel like a lot of people forget his greatest weakness. Any fast deck will run him over if you're trying to repeat Moss OTK as Captain Combustible. So if you're seeing a lot of Rustbolt, then fair enough, go Captain Combustible. You'll probably do great against Rustbolt. If you're seeing a lot of Immorticia, that also should do pretty good. But if you're seeing a lot more of these Z-Mech, Z-Mech, whatever decks, these Smash decks, these Boogaloo decks that play stupid fast, then I really wouldn't recommend trying to use Captain Combustible. A lot of people also brought up the importance of Wingnut, and I just want to say I wholeheartedly agree. I just didn't have a deck that Wingnut fit in. But if you're playing any solar hero, playing anything except an aggro deck, you should be running 4 copies of Wingnut if you can afford it. Wingnut is quite possibly the single most important plant in this entire meta right now, given how it shuts down both Frenzy and Quarterly Bonus, while also having extremely good stats for trading into aggressive minions, and being stupidly difficult to remove from the board. With that said, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.